She stood at her husband's grave with a rifle in one hand and a bank notice in the other. The man riding into town that morning was the one who had pulled the trigger 3 years ago. The jury had called him a killer. The town had called him a monster. And Claire Whitmore had spent 3 years calling him the reason her son grew up without a father. But nothing about Cole Raven was what she expected. He did not come back to run. He came back to finish what her husband had started. And what Thomas Whitmore had discovered before he died was something so dangerous that a very powerful man had spent 3 years trying to bury it. Literally. What was hidden on Claire's land? Why did her husband trust the man who killed him? And what happens when the only person who can save everything you love is the last person on earth you should trust? Stay with me. The answer will change the way you see forgiveness. This channel is where the American West comes alive. Stories of love found in hard country, of mothers who refuse to break, of strangers who become family, and of the extraordinary courage hiding inside ordinary people. If that is the kind of story that moves you, you are exactly where you belong. This story carries a truth I want you to hold on to. The people who save us are not always the ones we would have chosen. Sometimes grace arrives covered in dust, carrying someone else's guilt, asking only for the chance to do one right thing. Claire Whitmore had every reason to turn Cole Raven away. She had every reason to hate him. What she chose instead cost her everything, and gave her back more than she had lost. If this story reached something in you, I would love to know. Leave a comment below and tell me what moment stayed with you longest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are new here, subscribe and come back. There is always another story waiting.
The morning Cole Raven rode into Redemption Creek, I was standing at my husband's grave with a loaded rifle in my hands and a bank notice in my apron pocket. The town went quiet the way it only goes quiet when something is about to go wrong. Not the peaceful quiet of early morning, when the roosters have finished and the wind hasn't started yet. This was the held-breath quiet of 400 people deciding at the same moment whether to step outside or stay in. I was 29 years old. I had 200 cattle, 1 small boy, 6 weeks of money left, and a ranch that a very powerful man had been trying to take from me for 3 years. I watched that rider come down the main road and I thought, that is the man who killed Thomas. I did not know yet that he was also the only person on earth who could save us. His name had lived in this town like a bad smell since the night 3 years ago, when he walked into the Red Lantern Saloon and walked out again, and my husband did not. Cole Raven, the drifter, the killer, gone to Yuma prison on a manslaughter conviction and apparently possessed of either tremendous courage or tremendous stupidity, because here he was, riding back. He looked like what 3 years in prison made a man look like. Lean in the way of someone who had been given just enough to survive, a scar along his jaw that was new, hands that stayed visible on the reins at all times, which told me he understood exactly what this town thought of him, and was not going to give anyone a reason. He stopped at the water trough outside the feed store. Let his horse drink, that was all. People on the boardwalk stopped moving. A woman pulled her child inside. 2 men near the livery put their hands near their belts in that slow, drifting way that means trouble is considering introducing itself. I stayed where I was at the north fence, at Thomas's grave, with the rifle and the bank notice and 3 years of exhaustion sitting on my shoulders like a second coat. Eli found me before I found my next thought. He came running from the house at full speed, 6 years old and utterly without fear, because at 6 years old strangers still mean possibility. "Mama," he said, grabbing my arm and pointing, "there is a man. I see him. He has a good horse. Go back inside, Eli." "But Mama, inside." He went, but slowly, watching the stranger over his shoulder with those gray eyes that were his father's eyes exactly, the ones that missed nothing and forgot less. I walked down to the gate. Cole Raven looked at me across the water trough. He didn't pretend not to know who I was. He didn't look away. He just looked steady and quiet and waited to see what I would do. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "Mr. Raven, I am not here to cause trouble." Most men who cause trouble say exactly that. He accepted this without argument. My horse needed water. I will move on. Sheriff Roy Dobbs arrived then, riding hard from the direction of the courthouse, 2 deputies behind him. Dobbs was a man in his 50s with the look of someone who had made a series of choices he lived with badly. He pulled up between me and Cole with the practiced authority of a man who had been performing authority for so long he had mostly forgotten it was a performance. "Cole Raven," Dobbs said, "figured you had more sense than this." "My horse needed water," Cole said again. "Water's available in the next county. Keep riding." Cole looked at me once more. Something in his face that I did not have a name for. Then he gathered his reins. That evening, Pete Harmon came to my kitchen door. Pete was 17, thin as wire, with the careful movements of someone who had learned early that drawing attention was dangerous. He had worked my ranch for a year and a half, and I trusted him the way you trust someone when you have no other options, and they have not yet given you reason not to. He was out of breath. "There is a man camped outside the south fence," he said. "He asked me to tell you his name is Cole Raven. Said he figured you would want to know exactly where he was sleeping before morning came." I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark for a long time. Then I looked at the bank notice on the table. Then at Eli's boots by the door, already too small, no money for new ones. I did not make a decision, but I stopped holding the rifle quite so tightly. My mother used to say, "Never do business with a man whose eyes know too much." Cole Raven had those eyes. I invited him in anyway. I told myself it was practical. Looking back, I think I was lying to myself, but I would not understand that until much later. I met him at the barn at first light. I set the terms before he could speak. "Why did you kill my husband?" He did not flinch. He did not perform regret or innocence. He answered the way a man answers when he has told the same truth so many times, he has stopped hoping anyone will believe it. "Thomas drew first," Cole said. "I did not know why. I was not fast enough to stop it, only fast enough to survive it. The jury did not believe me. I accepted the verdict and served the time. I watched his face while he spoke. I had learned in 3 years of fighting for this ranch to read faces the way I read weather. He did not look like a man performing innocence. He looked like a man who was tired. "What do you want?" I asked. "Work," he said. 1 month. No wages. Room, board, 3 meals. You need someone. I need somewhere to be. That is the whole of it." I said no. He nodded, no argument, no pleading, and turned to go. That night I could not sleep. I heard something outside and went to the window expecting trouble. Cole was in the moonlight alone, repairing the section of fence that had been cut 2 nights before. Nobody asked him to. He had no lantern. He was working by feel and starlight, slow and methodical. I watched him for a long time. Then I went back to bed without saying anything. In the morning, I left a bowl of oatmeal outside the barn door before sunrise and went back inside before he found it. Neither of us ever mentioned it. Eli had no such restraint. He appeared at the barn mid-morning with a piece of cornbread and a list of questions he had clearly been composing since the previous day. Could Cole rope a steer? Yes. Could he shoot a gun? Yes. Did he know how to make a whistle out of grass? Cole said he did not. Eli said he would teach him and handed over the cornbread as an advance payment on the lesson. I was at the kitchen window drying a dish I had already dried twice. Senator Gerald Voss arrived at 11 in the morning in a fine buggy with brass fittings, and the particular ease of a man visiting property he already considers his own. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with a smile that arrived on his face without ever touching his eyes. He called me my dear twice. He expressed concern for my welfare in the way powerful men express concern for things they intend to acquire. He produced an offer in a sealed envelope. $15,000, more than I would get in foreclosure. He said it was generous. He said it was practical. He said he hated to see a woman in my position struggling alone. While he spoke, his eyes moved, just once, just a fraction of a second, to the tree line along the northwest corner of my property, then back to my face, smooth as water closing over a stone. I did not know what I had seen, but I remembered it. I told him I had just hired a new ranch hand and would not be selling. Voss smiled without surprise, like a man who had expected this answer and already planned 3 moves past it. "I do hope you will reconsider," he said, "before circumstances make the decision for you." After his buggy rolled back down the road, I walked to the barn. Cole was in the doorway watching the dust settle. "That is the man trying to take your ranch," he said. "Not a question." "He has been trying for 3 years," I said. "He has not managed it yet." I went back to the house. Cole looked at the northwest tree line for a moment, the place Voss's eyes had gone. Then he went back to work. The first week established itself like weather. Cole and I worked the ranch in parallel, mostly without speaking, learning each other's rhythms the way you learn the land. He was efficient and thorough, and never had to be told something twice. On the 4th day, we were repairing the barn roof in the afternoon heat, working from opposite ends toward the middle, when I reached for a board slightly too far, and my boot slipped on the dry wood. Cole caught me before I understood I was falling. One arm across my waist, solid and immediate. He set me steady and let go and stepped back to his side of the roof. 3 seconds, maybe 4. I went back to work. He went back to work. My internal accounting of those 3 seconds took considerably longer. That evening, Henry Calloway rode over from the neighboring ranch. Henry was in his 50s, a decent man in the way of men who are decent right up to the moment it costs them something. He told me Voss was working the town council. A resolution was being drafted, framed as public safety, targeting Cole specifically. If it passed, the sheriff would have grounds to remove Cole from the county entirely. Henry said he was sorry, said he had his own note at Voss's bank, said he could not stand with me on this one. After he left, I found Cole at the fence line and told him. He was quiet a moment. "He will not be the last one to say that." "I know," I said. "I stopped counting on people a long time ago." He looked at me with something I could not name. "You counted on me," he said. "I hired you," I said. "That is a transaction. It is different." I walked back to the house. Cole did not argue the point. But that evening he left a cup of coffee on the porch railing beside my chair without being asked and sat on the steps below. And we watched the dark come in over the hills together without speaking. I told myself it was practical. There is something deeply unsettling about living alongside a person you are supposed to hate. You start noticing things you have no business noticing. The way he always gives Eli the larger portion without being asked. The way he scans the horizon every single morning as if waiting for something to arrive. The way he never once asks me about Thomas, as if he understands that some wounds need to be left alone to close. By the end of the 2nd week, I had stopped thinking of Cole Raven as a problem I was managing, and started thinking of him as something else. I did not have a word for the something else. I was not ready to look for one. We were working a wounded heifer into the corner of the pen, Claire on one side of the rope, Cole on the other, when the animal lurched. Our hands collided on the rope. Both of us pulled back at the same instant. Neither of us said anything. Both of us pretended it had not happened. That evening I could not stop thinking about it, which was information I declined to examine. It was the 3rd evening of the 2nd week when I passed the barn and heard Eli's voice and stopped outside the door. Cole was sitting with his back against the barn wall. Eli was lying on his back in the hay, staring up through the open loft window at the emerging stars, pointing at them one by one. Cole said, "That one is the North Star. Drovers call it the fixed point. Everything else moves, but that one stays." Eli said, "What if it is cloudy?" Cole said, "Then you read the wind, the land. You learn to work with whatever is available." Eli said, "What if you are totally lost and everything is wrong?" A pause, long enough that I held my breath. Cole said, "Then you stop, you make camp, and you wait for the sky to clear." I stood outside that door for a long time. The following night, I was on the porch past midnight, which had become a habit I could not cure, when Cole appeared from the direction of the barn and stopped when he saw me. "Cannot sleep either," I said. "Rarely do." He sat on the step below my chair, close enough to talk, far enough to be careful. We watched the dark for a while. I told him about Thomas, not the death, which this town had dissected thoroughly enough, the life before it. How Thomas had been a frontier detective before we married. How he kept working after Eli was born because he said some things needed doing, and there were not enough people willing to do them. How the last 4 months before he died, he came home past midnight with ink on his hands and would not tell me what he was working on. I had never told anyone this. I was not sure why I was telling Cole. He listened without filling the silence with reassurance, which is what most people did. He listened the way you listen when you understand that the person speaking needs to be heard rather than comforted. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thomas did not walk into the Red Lantern by accident that night. He came to meet me." I looked at him. Cole told me carefully, watching my face. 6 months before Thomas died, he had received a letter forwarded through 3 different post offices. Thomas Whitmore, frontier detective, had tracked Cole down through old contacts. The letter was brief. Thomas was investigating a man named Gerald Voss for systematic land fraud. He needed someone with a particular background, someone who could move through places where a known detective could not, someone Voss would not recognize. Cole had agreed. They exchanged 2 more letters. On the night Thomas died, they were supposed to meet at the Red Lantern, and Thomas was going to give Cole something he had found, something significant enough that he had not wanted to commit it to paper. When I walked in, Cole said, he was already drinking, but wrong, not relaxed, agitated, eyes that could not quite focus. His hand was shaking when he reached for his glass. He stopped, looked at his own hands. I did not understand what I was seeing. I should have. When he reached for his gun, I reacted. It was over in 4 seconds. "Someone knew you were meeting," I said slowly. "Someone knew. And someone made sure it went wrong." The night was very quiet around us. "You spent 3 years in prison," I said finally, "for something someone else planned." "Yes. And you came back here." "I came back because the man who arranged it is still walking free, and because I owed Thomas Whitmore a debt I never got the chance to repay." I looked out at the northwest tree line, barely visible in the darkness, the place Voss's eyes had gone. "Get some sleep, Russ," I said. "We start on the north section at dawn." I went inside and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Everything I thought I knew about my husband's death had just changed shape. The next morning, 3 things happened. The bank delivered a new notice. A $200 property assessment fee had been added to my mortgage balance, assessed without prior written notice, which was a violation of the contract terms. Cole found it in 20 minutes of reading the mortgage document and flagged it with a piece of charcoal on the page margin. "There are 7 more like this," he said, setting the document on the kitchen table. "Fees assessed without proper notice. Penalties applied to payments that arrived on time. Interest calculations that do not match the agreed rate." "You read mortgage contracts?" I said. "I read everything in the prison library," he said. 3 years is a long time. The second thing, Edward Nash came to the back door. Nash ran the Redemption Gazette and had been Thomas's closest friend. A small man in his 60s, with the specific exhaustion of someone carrying knowledge he did not know what to do with. He told us he had submitted a formal records request to the county for the results of a railroad survey commissioned 8 months ago. The county had contracted a company called Meridian Engineering. Lead surveyor, a man named Marcus Tilden. The results had never been published. "I wrote to the Territorial Railroad Commission," Nash said. They told me the survey was under administrative review. That means someone with influence asked them to sit on it, Cole said. Nash nodded. The corridor that survey was commissioned to assess runs northwest to southeast across this county. He spread a county map on the table. Through the river crossing at Miller's Ford, through the gap in the Red Ridge. He put his finger on the northwest corner of my property. And through here. The third thing that happened that morning. Someone shot through the barn wall at 2 in the morning. The bullet punched through the siding 6 inches above where Cole slept. He was already moving when the sound faded, out the side door, low and fast. 2 sets of boot prints in the dirt. They had come from the east on foot, fired once and left. Cole brought the flattened bullet inside and examined it by lamplight. "This is expensive ammunition," he said. "This is not a drunk with a grudge." Eli had heard the shot. He came out in his nightshirt and found Cole in the yard and without a single word wrapped both arms around Cole's waist and held on. Cole went completely still, then slowly, carefully, put one hand on the back of Eli's head. I stood in the doorway. "Come on, baby," I said, keeping my voice even. "Back to bed." I did not look at Cole's face when I said it. I was afraid of what I would see there. More afraid of what he would see on mine. Redemption Creek runs on an unspoken rule. When Senator Gerald Voss wants something, you have 2 choices. You sell or you lose. I was working on a third option. I had not yet fully understood what the third option would cost. Cole had spent the better part of 2 days going through every document related to my mortgage. He sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread in front of him and a piece of charcoal in his hand, and went through it all the way a man goes through something when he has had 3 years to develop patience. He found 12 violations of the contract terms, fees assessed without the required 60 days written notice, a payment marked late when the bank receipt showed it had been processed 2 days before the due date, property assessment fees added to the balance without the legally required documentation. "This one," he said, pointing to a line on page 4, "is the clearest. They assessed a $150 fee in March. The contract requires 90 days written notice before any fee of this type can be added. The notice they sent was dated 32 days before the fee appeared." I looked at the page. "That is fraud. It is a violation of contract terms, which gives you grounds to dispute the foreclosure. It will not save the ranch on its own, but it will buy time." He looked up at me. "Time is what we need most right now." I drafted the dispute that afternoon at the kitchen table while Cole continued reviewing documents. We worked in the same room without speaking much, which had become normal in a way I had stopped cataloging. At one point we both reached for the same page and our hands came down on it at the same time. Cole pulled his hand back. I pulled mine back. We both looked at the page as if it were very interesting. "Sorry," I said. "Do not be," he said. He went back to reading. I sat with those 2 words for the rest of the afternoon. Henry Calloway came by the following morning. He was apologetic in the way of men who know they are doing the wrong thing and need the person they are wronging to tell them it is all right. He told me Voss had called in a favor with Judge Morrison. There was paperwork being prepared, citing Cole's criminal history and the public safety resolution the council had passed 2 days before to compel Cole's removal from the county. The sheriff would be required to enforce it. Henry could not help. He was sorry. His note at the bank. After he left, Cole said, "I should go." "No," I said. It came out faster than I intended. He looked at me. "Voss is counting on me to fold every time he applies pressure," I said. "I am done giving him that." Cole was quiet for a moment. "It will get worse." "It has been getting worse for 3 years," I said. "The direction of travel is not new." That afternoon, Sheriff Dobbs came to the ranch. He rode alone, without deputies, which meant this was not an official visit. He found Cole at the fence line. I watched from the porch. They talked for 5 minutes. I could not hear the words. When Dobbs rode away, Cole stood at the fence line, looking at nothing for a moment before coming back to the barn. I went to him. "What did he say?" Cole leaned against the fence post, looked at the horizon. He said he has known since the night Thomas died that the shooting was not what it appeared to be. He knew it at the time. He chose not to say so. A pause. He has a wife, 2 daughters, a mortgage note at Voss's bank. He told you this now? He told me because he wanted me to understand what I am up against. He said Voss does not bluff and does not leave loose ends. Cole looked at me. I think he was also telling me because he is tired of himself. I thought about that. Did it help? I asked. Knowing Dobbs believed you? Cole considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. It is the first time someone with authority said it. He said, yes, it helped some. That night, 3 of my steers were found shot dead in the south pasture. Clean kills, professional. Not rustling. No one had tried to take the animals, they had simply been killed and left, which was a message so clear it required no translation. I reported it to Dobbs. He rode out, looked around, told me there was nothing actionable without witnesses. He could not meet my eyes when he said it. When I got back to the ranch, Cole was in the south pasture looking at the dead cattle. He is not applying financial pressure anymore, I said. He is telling me what he can do. Yes, Cole said. What do we do? Cole crouched and looked at the ground around the carcasses. Boot prints. 2 sets. They had come from the east. We find out why he wants this land badly enough to do all of this, Cole said. Because the railroad survey does not fully explain it. A man like Voss could profit from a railroad right-of-way without any of this. Without the fence cutting, the financial strangling, the dead cattle. He stood up. There is something specific here, something he cannot risk anyone finding. He looked at the northwest tree line. He always looked at the northwest tree line. I keep coming back to that, he said. The way his eyes go there. It is just trees, I said. Cole looked at me. I do not think so, he said. Eli was asleep when I went back inside. I sat on the edge of his bed for a while, listening to him breathe. His stuffed bear was tucked under one arm, worn and soft from years of handling. Thomas had given it to him the week before he died. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark. Thomas, I thought. What did you know? What did you find that was worth dying over? I did not have the answer yet, but I was beginning to understand the shape of the question. I have spent 3 years learning to read a ranch. Weather, cattle, soil, water. Learning to see what is actually there instead of what I wish was there. It took me longer than it should have to apply the same skill to Gerald Voss. To look at him not as a nuisance, but as a system. And to understand that systems, no matter how powerful, have a structure. And structures have weak points. Cole and I rode to the county courthouse on a Tuesday. The land records were public. The clerk was unhelpful and made us wait 40 minutes before producing the ledgers, but she had no legal grounds to refuse. We sat at a long table with ledgers spread between us, shoulders almost touching because the table was narrow and there was no rearranging it. Cole traced ownership through a series of company names: Western Horizon Trust, Red Ridge Holdings, Frontier Land Partners, different names, different dates of incorporation. All of them wound back, through layered paperwork and cross-referenced addresses, to Gerald Voss. He had been buying land along a corridor running northwest to southeast for 4 years. Slowly at first, then faster. Some purchases were at fair market value. Others were far below, from families whose banknotes Voss had quietly purchased and then called in, forcing distressed sales. When you drew the purchases on a map, they formed a near-perfect line. Through Miller's Ford, through the Red Ridge Gap, through the northwest corner of my property. Cole pointed to a figure in one of the ledgers. His finger landed on the page a moment after mine had arrived at the same number. Neither of us moved our hands for a moment. Then Cole said, "The county paid $15,000 for a railroad survey 8 months ago. Results never published. If Voss is positioning to control the right-of-way corridor, he needs my land," I said. "The route goes through it." "Yes." Cole looked at the map we had sketched. But there is something I keep coming back to. Voss has enough political influence to compel the county to route the railroad favorably, even without controlling every parcel. He would not need to destroy you financially and kill your cattle to get a right-of-way deal. That is not the behavior of a man who merely wants a business advantage. I thought about what Dobbs had said, that Voss did not leave loose ends. There is something else, I said. Something he cannot let anyone find, Cole agreed. We rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon. Nash was waiting at the kitchen door. He came inside and sat at the table and turned his hat in his hands and did not quite look at either of us, which meant he was about to say something he had been carrying for longer than was comfortable. I was at the Red Lantern the night Thomas died, Nash said. I had known this. Half the town had been at the Red Lantern that night. I saw something I did not report, Nash said. I told myself I was not certain, that I might have been wrong, that it would not make a difference. He put the hat on the table. I have been telling myself that for 3 years, and I'm tired of it. He described a man he had seen that night. Not Voss himself, but someone who worked for Voss. A man Nash had seen at the bank and at Voss's office. This man had poured Thomas a drink from a private bottle separate from the bar stock, produced it from inside his coat. Nash had thought nothing of it at the time. Within 30 minutes, Thomas was visibly wrong. Nash reached into his coat and produced a small glass vial, stopped with a cork containing perhaps a tablespoon of cloudy liquid. He had taken it from Thomas's glass that night. An instinct, he said. He had not known what to do with it since. Cole took the vial, opened it, smelled it carefully. The expression on his face changed in a way I had not seen before. Datura extract, he said. Jimson weed. A small dose does not kill. What it does is distort judgment and reflex simultaneously. It causes agitation, paranoia, hair-trigger responses. A man who had been given enough of this would seem drunk but would not be, would seem aggressive without cause. He set the vial down on the table. Would be likely, he said very quietly, to reach for his gun when he would not otherwise have done so. The kitchen was completely silent. Thomas did not pick that fight, I said. He was induced to behave in a way that would get him killed, Cole said. And I was the mechanism. I was in the right place, and Voss knew I would be there because Thomas and I had been corresponding about meeting that night. He looked at me steadily. I am sorry. I have wanted to say that to you since I came back. I am sorry for what happened to Thomas. I am sorry for what it cost you and Eli. Nash left shortly after. Pete took Eli outside. Cole and I sat at the table with the vial between us. I did not cry. I had done most of my crying in the first year after Thomas died, in the dark after Eli was asleep. And I had made a decision somewhere in that year that I was finished with it. I was not finished. But I had made the decision. What I felt instead was something colder and more useful than grief. Anger. He planned it, I said. He needed Thomas gone before Thomas could expose him. He used you to do it. Yes. And then he watched me struggle for 3 years, knowing what he had done. Yes. I looked at the vial. We are going to take him apart, I said. Cole looked at me. Yes, he said. We are. For the next 3 days, Cole read every piece of paper I owned related to the ranch, the mortgage, and Thomas's estate. He organized them in chronological order on the kitchen table. I rode into town and filed the formal mortgage dispute with the bank, demanding written acknowledgement of receipt. The bank manager, a thin, nervous man named Gerald Pickens, read the dispute with the expression of someone receiving information they have been dreading. He told me he would need to consult with the board of directors. I told him the dispute was entered into the record and that the legally required review period applied regardless of who he consulted. I walked out with my head up. On the way back, I passed Voss on the main street. He was speaking with two men outside the hotel. When he saw me, he smiled, unhurried, completely confident. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I heard you were at the bank." "I expect you will hear more soon," I said, and rode past him. That evening, Cole was at the fence line when I got back. I dismounted and told him what had happened. He nodded, looked toward the northwest tree line in the way he had developed of looking there regularly. "Pete mentioned something this afternoon," Cole said. "He said Voss used to ask him every time he had the chance whether anyone ever went out to the northwest corner of the property." I looked at the trees. "Why would he care about that corner?" I said. "There is nothing there but the old stone fence and the oaks." "That is what I keep asking myself," Cole said. The light was going gold over the hills. The cattle were settling in the south section. Everything looked ordinary. "Tomorrow," I said. "I want to go out there and look." "Not yet," Cole said. "We are not ready yet. We go out there before we understand what we are looking for. Voss will know we are close, and we will have nothing to stop him with." He was right. I knew he was right. "Then we find out what we are looking for first," I said. "Yes," he said. "We find the surveyor." There are truths that, once you hear them, change the shape of everything that came before. Every memory, every grief, every anger you thought you understood. The truth about how Thomas died was that kind of truth. I have Cole Raven to thank for sitting with me in the dark afterward, saying nothing at all, which was exactly the right thing to do. Cole told me the name from Thomas's documents. Marcus Tilden, lead surveyor for Meridian Engineering, Silver City, 2 days' ride. He had been watching something in his own face carefully since Nash's visit, something I had noticed without knowing what to do with. When he said the name Marcus Tilden, that something shifted. "What is it, huh?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Marcus Tilden is my brother," he said. I sat with that. "Your brother signed his name to a fraudulent survey," I said. "Apparently. Did you know?" "No." The word was flat and certain. "We have not spoken in 8 years. A disagreement about our father's estate when we were both young and both stupid." He looked at the table. "I did not know he was in this county. I did not know he had any connection to any of this. What will you do?" Cole looked up at me. "The right thing, he said, whatever that costs." We left before dawn the following morning. Pete would stay with Eli. Nash would hold the documents. Cole had sent a telegram from the county seat the previous afternoon, addressed to the territorial investigator's office. We would not know for days whether it had reached anyone useful. The ride to Silver City took 2 full days through open country, the kind of wide landscape that strips away conversation and leaves only what is actually there. We talked in the way people talk on long rides, not continuously but in stretches, but separated by silences that became steadily more comfortable. Cole told me about Montana, where he had worked ranches in his early 20s. The specific quality of the light in September. A horse he had owned that could find water by smell. I told him about coming west with Thomas at 19, everything we owned in a single wagon, the first winter, the specific terror of my first calving season alone. We were telling each other our lives, not the notable events, the texture of the ordinary days that made up a life. I noticed this and did not remark on it. On the first night we made camp at a dry creek bend. Cole built a fire the way drovers do, minimal and smokeless. I taught him my grandmother's method of reading weather from cloud formation, which she had brought over from County Cork, along with opinions about everything. Cole said, "I like the idea that something always tells the truth eventually." I said she was a very practical woman. He said I meant it as a general principle. We looked at the fire for a while. The second night a summer storm came in fast. One lean-to between us barely adequate. We sat pressed together for warmth with our backs against the same tree trunk and the rain drumming on the oilskin above. Cole fell asleep first, the sudden drop of a man running on insufficient sleep for too long. His head tilted and came to rest on my shoulder. I did not move. I sat very still and listened to the rain and permitted myself for the first time to think clearly about what had been accumulating over the past weeks. The rope, our hands, the roof, those 3 seconds, the coffee in 2 cups every morning, the way he sat on the step below my chair in the evenings, as if he had always been there. At some point, I fell asleep too. In the morning, Cole woke first. He registered the position. My head had tipped against the top of his in the night. He sat completely still, watching the rain soften to mist, for a long time before either of us moved. We did not discuss it. We broke camp and rode. Marcus Tilden was hiding in a rented room above a Silver City hardware store with the curtains drawn in the middle of the afternoon. He opened the door at Cole's knock and stood in the doorway for a moment. He was older than Cole by perhaps 5 years, with the same dark coloring and the look of someone who had not slept well in weeks. He looked at his brother with the expression of a man who's been expecting a reckoning, and is surprised to find it arrives as quietly as this. "I wondered if you would come eventually," Marcus said. Cole said, "Can we come in?" Marcus stepped back. He confirmed the fraud quickly and without much hesitation, as if he had been rehearsing this conversation in the sleepless nights. He had been contracted by Meridian Engineering, which was controlled by Voss. He had been given the actual survey results showing the most practical railroad route running 5 miles south of the corridor Voss was assembling. He had been instructed to falsify the results, to show the route running through the corridor Voss controlled. He had done it. He had taken the money and told himself it was business, and had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since. He would not testify. He said this immediately before Cole could ask. Voss had been specific about consequences. His wife, his children, his professional license. Cole sat across from his brother and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I did 3 years in Yuma prison for a killing I was set up to commit. I came back to this county knowing what it would cost me. I am doing it because the man who used me to kill Thomas Whitmore is still in an office in Redemption Creek buying everything in sight with blood money, and his widow is about to lose everything she has." He leaned forward. "Staying silent is not staying safe," Cole said. "It is making someone else pay the price for what you are afraid to face. I know what that costs. I have been paying someone else's bill for 3 years. I am asking you to pay your own." Marcus looked at his hands for a long time. Then he said, "There is something else, something that was never in any report." He told us. During the survey, Voss had given him specific private instructions about one location, the northwest corner of a property recorded as the Whitmore Ranch. Marcus was to survey it carefully, note the specific geography and soil composition of a 20-foot radius around a cluster of 3 oak trees, and then remove all reference to that area from every record. Voss said it was a private matter. He did not explain further. Marcus had not asked. Cole and I looked at each other across the width of Marcus's small rented room. "We need to go back," Cole said. "Yes, I said. Marcus said quietly, "I will come. I will testify. Whatever you need." Cole looked at his brother for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. It was not a large word, but the way Marcus received it suggested it was exactly the right one. We rode back to Redemption Creek in 2 days, pushing harder than we had on the way out. Thomas always said Eli was smarter than both of us combined. I used to laugh at that. Sitting in that rented room in Silver City, hearing Marcus describe a specific cluster of oak trees on the northwest corner of my property, I started to think Thomas had been right about more things than I knew. Pete met us at the gate with Eli beside him, and Eli launched himself at me the moment I dismounted, with the full-body commitment of a 6-year-old who has been patient for 4 days and considers this a significant achievement. I held him for a long time. Over his shoulder, I saw Pete catch Cole's eye and give a small shake of his head. Something had happened while we were gone. Pete's expression was the particular look of someone who has done something they are not proud of and is working up to saying so. I learned what it was after dinner, after Eli was in bed, when Pete came to the kitchen and stood with his hat in his hands and told me everything. He had been reporting to one of Voss's men, Tuesday evenings at the south edge of town, basic information. Who came to the ranch, what Cole was doing, whether anyone went to the northwest corner. His father was alive and in hiding in another territory, wanted for a crime committed years ago. Voss had found this out and made it simple: report, or his father went to prison. Pete had thought the information was harmless, had told himself that, had stopped believing that some weeks ago. He did not try to justify it. He stood in the kitchen and told me what he had done and waited for the consequence. I looked at him for a long time. "From this point forward," I said, "you work for me. Actually, work for me. If you pass one word to Voss, one word, I will write personally to every territorial authority I can reach. Are we clear?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." I turned back to the stove. "There is coffee if you want it." Cole, leaning in the doorway, gave Pete the smallest nod. "You are all right." Pete's shoulders dropped 2 inches. After Pete left, Cole looked at me. "That was well done," he said. "He is 17, I said. "Voss chose him because he was 17 and alone and frightened. I'm not going to add to the list of people who have used that against him." Cole looked at me with that expression I had catalogued without naming. "No," he said quietly. "I did not think you would." That night I went in to sit with Eli before he slept, the way I did every night, the ritual that had held us together through 3 years of difficulty. He was already in bed with his worn stuffed bear tucked under one arm, the one Thomas had given him the week before he died. "Mama," Eli said, "I need to tell you something." "All right," I said. "Papa told me to keep this safe," he said, holding up the bear. "He said there was something special inside and I should only open it when we really need help." I went very still. "Eli," I said carefully, "when did Papa tell you that?" "The week before he went away," Eli said. "He was very serious about it. He made me promise." He looked at me with those gray eyes, Thomas's eyes. "I think we need help now," he said. "Do not we?" I took the bear gently and opened the seam along the back with my sewing scissors. Inside the stuffing, wrapped in oilskin and tied with waxed cord, was a small, tight roll. I brought it to the kitchen table. Cole stood beside me while I unrolled it. A hand-drawn map of the county, precise and detailed, showing a railroad route running 5 miles south of the corridor Voss had been assembling. A list of company names with corresponding transaction dates and dollar amounts, all in Thomas's methodical handwriting. Names that matched the companies Cole had found in the county ledgers. Numbers that confirmed the scope of the fraud. And at the bottom, a separate slip of paper folded twice. Thomas's handwriting. I would have known it anywhere. It said, "Cole Raven. Trust this man. He will know what to do with this." I am sorry I could not finish it myself. I read it twice. Then I looked at Cole. He was reading the note. Something moved across his face that I had not seen before. Something that was not the careful control he maintained most of the time. He looked for a moment like a man who had been standing in cold water for a very long time and had just stepped onto dry ground. "He trusted you," I said. "He should not have," Cole said very quietly. "I let him walk into that saloon." I put my hand over his on the table. I chose to do it. It was deliberate. My hand over his, and I left it there. "You were set up to be the instrument of his death," I said. "That is not the same thing as letting him die. You told Eli once that doing something bad and being bad are different things." I looked at him steadily. "I think it is time you believed your own words." Cole looked at my hand on his, then at my face. He turned his hand over slowly and held mine. We sat like that for a long time at the kitchen table with Thomas's last message between us. And outside the stars were very bright. And somewhere in the south pasture, the cattle were settling, and the ranch that had been dying for 3 years felt for the first time like something that might live. I have crossed hard country before. I know what 2 days of riding alone with a person does. It strips away every performance and leaves only what is actually there. I was not prepared for what was actually there in either of us, but that had already happened on the ride to Silver City. What happened now was something different. What happened now was that we stopped pretending we had not noticed. Marcus arrived at the ranch 3 days after we returned. He came quietly, no announcement, tying his horse at the fence and waiting to be invited in with the demeanor of a man who understood he was not owed a welcome. Cole met him at the gate. They stood together for a moment, these two men who had been brothers and then strangers for 8 years. And then Cole put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and Marcus closed his eyes briefly. And that was the reconciliation. No speech, no accounting of the years, just the hand and the closed eyes and the beginning of something being rebuilt. Nash came that evening with news from the Territorial Investigator's Office. Cole's telegram had reached a man named Robert Chenault, a senior investigator who had been building a case against Voss on separate financial grounds for 18 months. He had been waiting for evidence specific enough to move on. What Cole had sent him was more than enough. Chenault was 2 days out from Redemption Creek. 2 days, I said. We need to keep Voss from knowing we have contacted the territorial office, Nash said. If he suspects the investigation is coming from above the county level, he will destroy whatever he can destroy and move whatever he can move. He will not find out from us, Cole said. But that night, past midnight, I heard horses on the road, multiple riders, not bothering to be quiet. I went to the window. 4 men in the yard, one of them Voss himself. I had never seen Voss come to the ranch at night. The performance of civility was apparently over. Cole was already outside when I got there, standing in the yard with his hands visible, and his posture that particular quality of stillness I had come to recognize as the way he looked when he was prepared for things to go badly. Voss looked at Cole for a moment with something on his face that was not quite the confident pleasantness he usually wore. "Mr. Raven," Voss said, "I had hoped we could avoid this stage. Mrs. Whitmore is not selling," Cole said. "Mrs. Whitmore is not the one I am speaking to at the moment." Voss leaned forward on his saddle. "I am going to be straightforward with you," he said. "Whatever you think you know about my business affairs, you do not have evidence that will survive scrutiny in a county court. The judge is not sympathetic to your cause. The sheriff is not sympathetic to your cause. You have one witness, a surveyor with a criminal liability of his own, and a collection of documents that any competent attorney will characterize as circumstantial." Cole said nothing. "Walk away," Voss said. "Take the woman and the boy somewhere they can start fresh. I will make the mortgage debt disappear. No foreclosure, no record, a clean beginning. The mortgage debt disappears when the fraud that created it is corrected," I said from the porch. Voss looked at me. The pleasant expression was entirely gone now. "I am trying to be reasonable," he said. "No," I said. "You are trying to determine how much you need to offer to make us stop. The answer is that there is no number. We are not stopping." Voss looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and left without another word. Cole came to the porch. We stood together in the dark, listening to the hoofbeats fade. "He is going to move soon," Cole said. "He knows the terms have changed." "How long do we have?" "Until he understands that we have contacted someone above the county level. Once he knows that, he will do whatever he needs to do to eliminate the evidence." "The evidence is on my property, Amar," I said. Cole looked at me. "Yes," he said, "it is, and tomorrow morning we are going to go get it." That night I could not sleep. I lay in bed thinking about Thomas, who had known enough to hide documents in his son's toy and trust a near stranger to finish what he had started, who had been 2 steps ahead of Voss right up to the moment Voss had taken the 3rd step first. I thought about Cole sleeping in the bunkhouse or not sleeping, which I suspected was more likely. I thought about Eli's gray eyes telling me we need help now with the certainty of a child who understands more than adults give him credit for. At some point, I got up and went to the kitchen to make coffee. Cole was already there. We looked at each other across the kitchen. "Could not sleep," I said. "No," he said. He poured 2 cups without being asked, set one in front of me. We sat at the table where Thomas's documents were spread, the evidence of 3 years of a good man's careful work, and drank coffee in the middle of the night, and did not need to fill the silence with anything because the silence itself had become a kind of language between us. After a while, Cole said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something." "All right," I said. "I came back here to repay a debt," he said. I told myself that was the reason. The only reason. He looked at his coffee cup. I was not entirely honest with myself. I waited. "I stayed because of you," he said. "Because of the way you fight. Because of the way you treated Pete when you had every reason not to. Because of the way you sat on that porch every night and refused to stop." He looked up at me. "I would like to stay past the end of this, if you will let me. Not as an employee, as something else." I looked at him across the kitchen table. "We will finish tomorrow first," I said, "and then we will have that conversation properly." He nodded. "Yes," he said. "All right." We sat with our coffee until the sky began to lighten in the east. Then we got up and went to work. There are secrets that people keep, and secrets that the land keeps. People can be bought and threatened and silenced. Land just holds what is given to it and waits. It does not have a choice about what it knows. Neither, in the end, did we. We went to the northwest corner before sunrise, Cole and I, with 2 shovels and the specific coordinates Marcus had given us from memory. The old stone fence, the oak grove, ground undisturbed for years. The 3 oaks stood in a rough triangle. Marcus had said 20 feet from the center tree, slightly north. We dug. 2 feet down, the earth changed color. Cole said, "Stop." He knelt and cleared the next layer by hand. What we found, I will not describe in detail. I will say only that it was a woman, carefully buried with a gold locket around what had been her neck. The locket was tarnished but intact. On the back engraved EV Forever G. Inside, a small hand-painted portrait of a young woman with dark hair and a serious expression. Eleanor Voss, Gerald Voss's wife, officially reported missing 10 years ago. Her considerable personal fortune had passed entirely to her husband upon her legal declaration of death 3 years after her disappearance. I crouched beside the grave and looked at Eleanor's portrait for a long time. She had been buried here, on land that Voss did not yet own because he had not owned it when she died. Thomas had bought this property 8 years ago, 2 years after Eleanor disappeared. From the moment Thomas signed the deed, Voss had been trying to get it back. Not for the railroad, for her, for the evidence she represented. Thomas started asking questions, I said, about the land purchases, about the survey, about Voss, and got close enough to the truth that Voss could not let him keep going, Cole said. So Thomas had to go. I stood up. And now Voss needs to make all of it disappear before Chenault arrives. We heard horses at the same moment. Multiple riders coming fast from the direction of town, not bothering with quiet. We had perhaps 2 minutes. Cole looked at me. "Stay behind me." "No," I said. He looked at me. "Beside you," I said. "I will stand beside you, not behind you." Something moved across his face. "All right," he said. "Beside me." A Voss came with Sheriff Dobbs and 4 armed men. He pulled up at the edge of the oak grove and looked at what we had uncovered, and his face did not change. That was the most frightening thing. He looked at his wife's remains with the expression he used in business meetings. "Put it back, hon," he said. "Both of you walk away. The mortgage disappears. The ranch is yours, free and clear. Enough money to rebuild properly. And Mr. Raven has safe passage out of this territory today." "You killed her," I said. I protected my interests, Voss said. I have been doing so for 30 years. It is not personal, Mrs. Whitmore. It is personal to her, I said. I did not step back. Cole stood beside me exactly as I had asked. Voss nodded to his men. They moved their horses forward. Sheriff Dobbs did not move with them. He sat on his horse looking at the ground where Eleanor Voss had been buried for 10 years, and at the men Voss had brought, and at Cole standing in the oak grove with his hands at his sides. Dobbs had known since the night Thomas died that something was wrong. He had known it and chosen silence and spent years living with the cost of that choice. I had watched it in his face every time I had reported damage to my property, and he had told me there was nothing actionable. He made a different choice now. He dismounted, took 2 steps away from Voss's men, put his hands away from his weapon. I am not dying for this, Dobbs said. I am done. One of Voss's hired men looked at the others. The certainty had gone out of them. From the east, the sound of riders, more than 4, coming at speed. Nash appeared at the tree line with 2 men in territorial coats, and behind them, 4 more. Robert Cheneau, senior territorial investigator, had arrived a day early. Voss looked at the approaching riders, at Dobbs standing apart, at me, who had not moved. He turned his horse toward the open country to the west. He got 3 strides. Cole caught him with a tackle that put them both hard into the Texas dirt. He did not hit Voss. He simply held him there, one knee, both of Voss's wrists pinned, until Cheneau and his men arrived. That is enough, Cole said quietly into the dirt. It is over. Cheneau took Voss without ceremony. The hired men surrendered. Dobbs assisted in the handover with the focused cooperation of a man who understood this was his last chance to be on the right side of something. I stood at the edge of the oak grove looking at the sky above the place where Eleanor had been buried for a decade, and thought about all the things that had been hidden here under this ordinary Texas ground, waiting for someone to come looking. Cole came and stood beside me. I was shaking. The specific shake that comes after adrenaline, when the body processes what the mind held at arm's length during the crisis. My hands, my shoulders. Cole put his arms around me. Not tentatively, like someone who had made a decision he was at peace with. I turned into him and held on. We stood in the oak grove while the territorial investigators worked around us and the sun finished rising over Redemption Creek. And I stopped shaking eventually, and neither of us said anything because nothing needed to be said. People ask me sometimes what redemption looks like. They expect something dramatic. A courtroom speech, a public exoneration, some moment when the record is officially set right. What nobody tells you is that it mostly looks like ordinary mornings. Gerald Voss was arrested on 3 counts: the murder of Eleanor Voss, conspiracy in the death of Thomas Whitmore, systematic land fraud across 14 separate properties. Marcus Tilden testified. In exchange for full cooperation, he received a suspended sentence. Cole stood beside him in the territorial courthouse on the day of the hearing. He did not say anything. He simply stood there so Marcus would not stand there alone. That was all. It was enough. Sheriff Roy Dobbs resigned his position and left Redemption Creek quietly. The investigators determined he had been complicit through inaction but had not participated directly in any crime. He was not charged. He stopped on his way out of town and left his deputy's badge on my porch railing without a note. I found it in the morning. I left it there for a while before deciding what to do with it. Judge Morrison recused himself from all proceedings related to Voss. A territorial judge was brought in. She was efficient, thorough, and entirely unimpressed by local politics. She voided every fraudulent fee the bank had assessed against my mortgage, restructured the remaining debt to the original contract terms. I was not behind. I had never been behind. The bank had simply needed me to believe I was. The 14 properties Voss had acquired through financial pressure were reviewed one by one. Several were returned to their original owners. Families who had believed they had lost everything found, in some cases, that they had not lost it permanently. The railroad survey was reprocessed by legitimate engineers appointed by the Territorial Commission. The true route, running 5 miles south of the corridor Voss had assembled, was submitted and approved. The land values along the actual route adjusted accordingly, distributed across a wide range of ordinary landowners, rather than concentrated in the hands of one man. Eleanor Voss was reburied in the Redemption Creek Cemetery with her name on a proper marker. The town came for that, more people than I expected. There is something about a woman who has been hidden for 10 years that makes people want to acknowledge her existence when they finally can. Henry Calloway was the first neighbor to come to the ranch with practical help. He arrived with 3 of his hands and a wagon load of lumber the week after the arrest and started work on the barn extension without being asked and without quite meeting my eyes, which was his way of apologizing. I let him work. I made coffee for everyone. That was my way of accepting. Others came after. Women with food, and men with tools, and neighbors who had looked away during the hard years, returning now with the particular awkward energy of people who know they failed a test and are trying to make something right. I accepted the help without comment. Cole watched me do it and understood what it cost, and did not say anything about it, which was correct. Pete stayed. He worked with the focused intensity of someone earning their place from scratch, which was exactly what he was doing. By the end of the first month, I had stopped watching him and simply relied on him. That was the only accounting either of us needed. Marcus settled 12 miles east and took a surveying position with the county's new engineering office. He came to the ranch on Sunday afternoons sometimes. He and Cole did not address the 8 years directly. They talked about other things, gradually and then more easily, the way brothers do when they are finding their way back to each other from a long distance. Edward Nash ran a 4-part series in the Redemption Gazette on the railroad fraud, the land scheme, and the death of Eleanor Voss. He wrote Thomas's name in the first paragraph, and did not diminish what Thomas had discovered or what it had cost him. I read it 3 times. The third time I did not cry. The town changed. Slowly, the way towns change, which is not quickly and not completely, but genuinely. New members on the council, new management at the bank, a new sheriff recommended by Chenot, a woman named Frances Holt, who had worked investigations in the Northern Territory and who regarded Redemption Creek's recent history with the brisk interest of someone who finds a mess and sees an opportunity to make it clean. I liked her immediately. Cole packed his saddlebags on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after the arrest. I came out of the house and found them sitting outside the barn door, and I stood there looking at them for a moment before going to find him. He was in the barn with the roan, not in a hurry, moving through the morning tasks the way he always did, methodical and thorough. "Where?" I said. He turned around. "I have not decided," he said. "But you are stable now. The ranch is stable. Nash has the story. Chenot has the evidence. You do not need Cole." He stopped. I crossed the barn floor and stood in front of him. "I need you to stop deciding what I need," I said. "I have had people deciding that for me for 3 years. The bank decided, Voss decided, even Thomas decided in his way, keeping secrets to protect me from worry." I looked at him steadily. "I'm going to tell you what I actually need, clearly, without anyone having to be in danger for me to be honest about it." "All right," he said quietly. "I need you to stay," I said. "Not because of the fences, though the fences do need someone who knows what they are doing. Not only because of Eli, though God knows he would take it hard. I need you to stay because somewhere between the fence line and the courthouse and a rainstorm in the middle of nowhere, I stopped thinking of you as the man connected to Thomas's death and started thinking of you as mine." I took a breath. "And I am fully aware of how complicated that is, and I do not care. I would like you to put down the saddlebags." Cole looked at me. He was quiet long enough that I wondered if I had miscalculated. If the careful distance he had maintained was not restraint but preference. If I had read the 2 cups of coffee and the hand over mine on the kitchen table incorrectly. Then he said, "I told myself I came back here to repay a debt. I know. I told myself that was the whole of it. I know." I was not being honest with myself. He reached up and touched my face. both hands, calloused and careful, and completely certain. He kissed me. I kissed him back without hesitation, because I had made the decision some time ago, and had simply been waiting for the moment to say so. When we separated, Eli was standing in the barn doorway with his arms crossed, and the expression of a 6-year-old who has been patient for an extremely long time, and considers himself owed acknowledgement for this. "Finally," Eli said. He turned around and walked back toward the house. Cole looked at me. I looked at Cole. We both laughed, and it was the easiest thing in the world. I went to Thomas's grave before anyone else was awake 3 mornings later. The light was coming up gold over the eastern hills. The cattle were moving in the south section. From the direction of the barn, I could hear Cole's voice, low and unintelligible, talking to the roan the way he did every morning. I sat beside the grave for a while. "He stayed," I told Thomas. "I think you knew he would. You always were better at reading people than I was. It used to irritate me. I am choosing to find it endearing now." I placed a handful of wildflowers against the marker. Whatever grew here, plains flowers, tough and ordinary and persistent. Eli is well. He is growing out of everything at a rate that I find alarming. He wants a dog. Cole said he would think about it, which means yes. I smoothed the ground beside the marker with my palm. "Nash wrote about you in the paper. Your name in the first paragraph. What you found and what it cost. People know, Thomas. They know what you were trying to do." I sat for another moment in the rising light. "I think we're going to be all right, well," I said. "I think that is what you were arranging." I walked back toward the house, toward the smoke rising from the chimney where Pete had started the kitchen fire, toward Eli's voice carrying across the yard, explaining something to Cole with enormous urgency and detail, something about a frog he had found at the creek, the specific qualities of this frog, why this frog was exceptional among frogs. Cole was listening with the full, focused attention he gave to things that mattered. He looked up and saw me coming across the yard. He raised one hand, not a wave, an acknowledgement. "I see you. You are home." I raised mine back. Redemption Creek got its name from a spring that saved a wagon train from dying of thirst. One source of water in the right place at the right moment. The story was that the wagon master had been ready to turn back, had made the decision and turned the lead wagon around, and then someone's child wandered toward a stand of cottonwoods and found water underneath them. The child did not know they were looking for water. They were just walking toward trees. I used to think that was a nice story about luck. Now I think it is a true story about something else, about the things we find when we stop insisting on finding only what we came looking for, about how salvation sometimes arrives covered in dust, asking for nothing more than water for a horse, and the chance to be something different than what everyone has decided it is. Cole Raven came back to Redemption Creek to repay a debt. He stayed because we gave him something he had stopped believing he deserved, a fixed point. The way Eli described the North Star. Everything else moves, but that one stays. Some mornings I stand on the porch before the house is awake and look at what Thomas and I built here, what was almost taken and was not, what has been rebuilt board by board and day by day into something stronger than it was before. I think about Eleanor Voss in the proper cemetery now with her name on a stone, no longer hidden, about families with their land back, about Marcus finding his way back to his brother across 8 years of silence, about Pete, who is 18 now and no longer moves like someone expecting to be struck. I think about Thomas, who saw clearly and paid the full price for it, and whose last act was to hide the truth in his son's toy bear and trust the right person to find it. I think about how long it took, how close we came to losing. And then I hear Eli inside the house asking Cole something with the relentless curiosity of a boy who has decided Cole is the most reliable source of information on every subject. And I hear Cole answer him in that quiet, steady voice. And I hear Eli ask a follow-up question because there is always a follow-up question, and I hear Cole answer that too. I go inside. The coffee's already made. 2 cups on the table, which has been the way of it since the very beginning. since before either of us would say plainly what we meant. Some things do not need to be explained, they just need to be continued. That is what redemption looks like, as far as I can tell. Not a moment. A decision made again every morning to stay in the place where you are known and needed and, if you are lucky enough and brave enough to accept it, loved. We are lucky. We are home. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
The story of Redemption Creek is, at its heart, a meditation on truth, justice, and the quiet, cut-in path toward redemption. Told through the voice of a woman hardened by loss and survival, it reveals that moral clarity is rarely immediate. Instead, it is something earned through patience, courage, and the willingness to confront painful truths. One of the central meanings of the story lies in its exploration of misjudgment and prejudice. Cole Raven returns as a man already condemned in the eyes of the town, a killer, an outsider, a threat. Yet, as the narrative unfolds, we come to understand that appearances can conceal deeper realities. The true villain is not the man society has labeled guilty, but the one who hides behind power, respectability, and influence. This inversion reminds us that justice cannot rely on reputation alone. It demands inquiry, courage, and integrity. Equally important is the theme of moral courage. The protagonist, a widow burdened by grief and responsibility, must choose between safety and truth. For years, she survives by enduring, but survival is not the same as living rightly. When she begins to question the accepted version of her husband's death, she steps into danger, but also into moral responsibility. Her journey teaches that doing what is right often requires standing alone, resisting pressure, and refusing to yield to fear or convenience. The story also emphasizes accountability and redemption. Cole Raven embodies this idea most clearly. Though he was manipulated into committing an act that cost an innocent man his life, he does not hide from it. Instead, he returns to face judgment, to uncover the truth, and to make amends. His redemption is not granted easily. It is built through actions, sacrifice, and honesty. This suggests that redemption is not about erasing the past, but about confronting it and choosing differently in the present. Another profound lesson concerns the corrupting nature of power. Gerald Voss represents a system where wealth and influence distort justice. His crimes extend beyond individual acts. They form a network of manipulation affecting entire communities. The story warns that unchecked power can silence truth and exploit the vulnerable, and that systems, not just individuals, must be challenged to restore fairness. Finally, the narrative offers a quieter, deeply human message. Healing is possible. Through trust, cooperation, and shared struggle, broken lives begin to mend. The relationship between the widow and Cole shows that forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means understanding, accepting, and choosing to move forward. In conclusion, the story teaches us that truth may be buried, but it endures, that justice requires courage, and that redemption is a daily choice. It is not found in grand gestures alone, but in steady acts of honesty, resilience, and love.